Hi, I'm David. This is June. Sorry, baby. Um, and it's a beautiful sunny morning here in sunny Santiago, as the great Ron Burgundy would say. And I wanted to talk this morning about fundamentalist religion and trauma. And I'm thinking about two religions in particular, both religions that I have extensive experience with. The first is fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, which is the religion that I grew up with. Um, And then the second is a religion I just happen to find myself surrounded by. Uh, and that's wokeism. Um, and the parallels between the two religions are quite stark. And the consequences on my psyche were, in both cases, quite severe. And so I'm trying to work my way out. Um, and so I think what I'd like to do, as always, I'm going to talk extemporaneously, is to describe the parallels between wokeism and fundamentalist Christianity, um, the experience of what it's like to be a dissenter, and for the most part, a silent dissenter, although I've been speaking up much more in the last couple of years, within a fundamentalist religious community, and the kind of fear of ostracism, the fear um, of expulsion and not having one's needs met that go along with being a silent dissenter within a fundamentalist religion. Uh, so I grew up in fundamentalist Christianity, and there is a particular narrative that one is given. So the narrative of fundamentalist Christianity is that human beings existed in a state of um, in Eden, sort of in a perfect state, a state without suffering, and it's represented by a garden, which simultaneously represents order, but then also a closeness to nature in some ways, with sort of nature being ordered. There is a fall from grace through human choice, a descent into sin and to suffering, the present world. Um, there is, uh, again, within fundamentalist Christianity, very, very strong and absolute rules about how one should earn salvation. Um, and it's a very complex set of rules that one learns. The overall uh, piece is, you could say, simple. It's confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead and you'll be saved. That's a Bible verse. But the actual dogma is very, very complex. And um, in breaking any one of these rules, especially rules around sexuality, um, is something that puts one in danger of damnation. So on the one hand, there is this paradise that one can achieve if one follows these rules quite strictly. And on the other hand, there is eternal damnation if one fails to follow the rules. And we had these kinds of questions in youth group growing up, like what happens if somebody confesses with their mouth Jesus is Lord and believes in their heart that God raised him from the dead, and um, then they commit some major sin, like they commit adultery. Are they going to heaven? And these were sort of these weighty questions. I think it was resolved that they would, because they at one point had made the commitment and they had fallen into sin. Um, but obviously, this is the answers to these complex questions carry a great deal of weight because they determine whether one's going to paradise or hell. And there's no middle ground in fundamentalist Christianity. There's no purgatory. There's a very strong in-group and out-group distinction between we Christians and what's called the world, the non-Christian world. There is an emphasis on human beings as inherently sinful, that there's something that's fundamentally wrong with us, that we're born with. And in some ways, we can't choose to not be that way. We are fallen into sin. The only way to expiate the guilt from this sin is to believe wholeheartedly in the religion. That's the way to expiate guilt. You believe wholeheartedly in the religion, you adopt and confirm your alignment with the group norms. But the sin never really goes away. This is the strange thing. According to the doctrine, it does. According to the doctrine, Christ, through his sacrificial atonement, in conjunction with believers' belief, results in the wiping away of sin. But nevertheless, there was always the sense that human beings were deeply sinful. This was most notable around sexuality, where sexuality was said to be a good thing, but it really was treated as it was kind of a de facto dirty thing. And certainly any kind of sexual desire or sexual activity that didn't take place strictly within the confines of a marriage was something that was held up as sinful. And so maybe that's a brief sketch of fundamentalist Christianity in some of its aspects, right? So there is the perception of a paradise. There is a fall into sin and into guilt. There's never really a leaving of guilt in this life. But if one wants to, in some ways, not be as guilty, strong adherence to group norms, which are often very arcane and don't make sense outside of the group, is required. And there's a very strong in-group and out-group distinction. And there's always a threat, in some ways, of being ostracized and expelled from the group. And that threat is the case even if it's got some F-18s and F-35s from the Miramar Air Base. That's one of the disadvantages of living in La Jolla, one of the few disadvantages. The threat of ostracism, the threat of shame, the threat of sort of even this low-level social censure is always present if one signals a disloyalty for what's perceived as being a disloyalty to these very, very particular, strict, and arcane social norms. And I left that form of Christianity when I was 17. I actually told my parents I wasn't a Christian, although I kept going to church for the next year because they made me. And I'm actually back to being a person of faith. I go to a church that is less fundamentalist and has a much smaller creed and really has just a lot of people that are loving each other. And I'm still working my way through that and what I think of it. And partly it's also me in the sense that I'm okay with other people believing things that are slightly different than me. And so, we encounter the world not and have a response to the world, not just because of the way the world is. I'm not using the world in a Christian sense. I'm just saying world, right? And all of being as a consequence, not just the way it is, but the way that we are. We co-world with the world. Okay, so wokeism. Man, this thing is weird. Man. So I got a little bit of it when I was studying at Florida International University, but just a little bit. And I started reading some of the philosophical underpinnings of it, actually, way back in my 20s when I was getting a second bachelor's degree. So I read the postmodernists and some of the critical theorists, and I thought that they were weird then. I thought that this... I thought that they were contradicting themselves at the time. And I've talked a little bit about postmodernism in other videos. I did a video about 1,000-year history of the university while we're at. So I'm not going to go into it. You can think about kind of the present movement as an intellectual movement. You can think about wokeism as an intellectual movement. with its sort of groundings in postmodernism and neo-Marxism, and a lot of people do that. But I think fundamentally it is perpetrated throughout the university and adopted by people that don't read the postmodernists and don't read the Marxists, which is the vast majority of people, because it meets fundamental human needs. And that's what religion does, right? It meets fundamental human needs. And so I'll go through wokeism. Wokeism has many of the same outward characteristics that fundamentalist Christianity does, believe it or not. There are readings within feminist theory, within critical gender studies, that actually present for the reader a kind of Eden. In the Middle Ages, no less, which is weird. I've read some of these articles actually in a theory course in anthropology. It's extraordinary. These folks were claiming that there were hidden forms of birth control that women had access to in the Middle Ages before the patriarchy took it away from them. There's no evidence for this. There is some evidence, at least according to the papers that I read, that women used to have a lot more property, and much of that was taken away during the witch hunts. And so they're saying there's a patriarchal aspect to the witch hunts. But the birth control thing was very, very interesting. And there was definitely within these papers, even if they presented some things that were factually accurate, a general disposition towards fantasy. So the Middle Ages, which of course were not a particularly pleasant time to live in, were in some ways portrayed as pre-capitalist and therefore Edenic. It's a totally ahistorical projection onto the past of this fantasy of this Eden that preceded the capitalist fall. So there's the fall. So we had this pre-capitalist Eden. There's no anthropology that indicates that it was a particularly pleasant time to live before capitalism, by the way. It was societies in urban areas were highly stratified. There was a lot of violence. Social stratification long precedes capitalism. I'm not going to get into sort of pre-capitalism, but it certainly was not an Eden. We have no indication that it was an Eden. But in this literature, it's held up as an Eden. And then there is the fall into capitalism, and that's the Marxist sort of claim, or the claim that isn't necessarily Marxist, but they use Marxist to make it. And in particular for the wokeists, it's a fall into racial capitalism. And racial capitalism is the proposition that capitalism is used in order to funnel value from certain races to other races. Again, I'm not saying that I believe in discrete races. I'm saying this is the claim of racial capitalism, which treats race as a set of discrete categories. I made another video about that called Racial Animus Taking Over Academia. You can take a look at that. And so there is the Eden. There is the fall into racial capitalism, also which has no empirical evidence for it, by the way. The incomes of African Americans have risen at a faster rate year on year than actually for whites. The last time I looked at it, it was about the same, but African Americans was a little higher. So the very sort of empirical evidence that would be used to substantiate claims of racial capitalism, to my view, doesn't exist. You have the Eden, you have the fall, and then you have the fall into sin. And the sin is slavery. That's the sin. Slavery, Jim Crow, racism. Now, you had slavery long predating capitalism. It's been around forever. It's been in every society. So the sin, if you were to take up the categorical, the schema of wokeism, actually precedes the fall, actually precedes capitalism. But again, it's a religion. It doesn't have to make sense. You never hear people talking about slavery in other places. Slavery is sort of this thing that was portrayed as uniquely a European invention. Again, it's a religion. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to square with the facts. So you have the Eden, you have the fall into racial capitalism, you have the sin, which is the slavery, And you have this set of arcane, complex rules that you have to follow in order to, uh, if not escape the sin, at least be less sinful, just like fundamentalist Christianity, right? So you have to do the work, you have to read the right books, you have to use the right language, you have to see the world the right way. The sun keeps moving, so I'm going to keep moving to kind of keep it off my face. I like the warmth of it, but it's also every time I move, June freaks out. All right. She's right here. She's still here. You have the rules that you have to follow in order to not be guiltless, but in order to have somewhat less guilt. And they include a wide variety of arcane rules and language, right, that doesn't make a lot of sense outside. So in Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity, there would be things like substitutionary atonement, predestination, the gifts of the Spirit. I remember we had these conversations in youth group growing up about which were the gifts of the Spirit and which were just regular gifts, right? And each person got at least one gift of the Spirit, and it was really important to get the list right. These sorts of things. And within wokeism, you have, and it was very important that you believe this in order to achieve your salvation. I don't think they would have said that, well, if you don't get the exact list of the fruits of the Spirit right, that you were going to go to hell, in all fairness to those folks. But it was still nevertheless held up as something that was important and that you should know. And so the arcane rules of wokeism are varied and they keep changing. Power is bad. Power hierarchies are bad. You need to dismantle the hierarchies. You have to defund the police. What else? You have to see what's going on in the Holy Land through the lens of white supremacy. That has to be the framework that you use. What else? You have to view racism not as an individual animus that an individual can carry, but as rather something which is baked into institutions. There are two kinds of people, right? There are the racists and the anti-racists, just like in Christianity, there are the Christians and the non-Christians, the Christians in the world. In wokeism, they're the racists and the anti-racists. And that's fundamentally what matters about a human being. All the other dimensions are kind of lost. And what becomes operative for the purposes of inclusion or exclusion from the community he's reading is whether you're a racist or an anti-racist. There is expiation through confession, right? These were parts of the anti-racism DEI trainings. Was you were supposed to acknowledge your privilege, right? Which is an equivalent to acknowledging your sin. Privilege definitely had this negative connotation to it. And deviation, and then there was a whole thing around gender, which has its own correlation within fundamentalist Christianity. So in fundamentalist Christianity, there are exactly two kinds of people, men and women, and exactly one kind of acceptable sexual relationship, which is to say to be married. And deviation from sexual or gender norms is highly stigmatized and puts one at threat of being ostracized. Wokeism presents this sort of opposite but same view. On the one hand, it says we reject all that, and any form of sexual arrangement is equally valid as any other form, provided that consent is there. But when you dig down to it, it has its own hard, ossified set of beliefs that you dare not question. So one of those hard ossified beliefs is that um, gender is an absolute social construct. You can't question that. Um, they'll make the claim that gender is a social construct, and yet individuals who are transgender have an innate disposition towards one gender. In other words, you can have an innate disposition towards a construct, which doesn't make any sense. Again, but you have to repeat that mantra, right? It doesn't have to be an internally coherent set of belief systems, but you have to repeat the mantra. Gender is constructed. Transgenderism is innate in some way. You have to have very, very particular ideas about what consent means. This is the idea of affirmative consent. So you can't give pre-consent. Consent has to be continuous. It has to be ongoing. So, for example, if you have two people in a marriage, and one of them wakes the other person up in a bit of a physically amorous way in the morning after when they're doing fine, the relationship is great. Maybe they had hot sex the night before. That would be construed, according to wokeism, as sexual assault. Strangely enough, likewise, if a married couple goes out on their anniversary, has a great dinner, gets home, gets a little sloshed, and then has sex with each other, they both raped each other, according to the latest consent theory at the university. So again, very hard rules, very strong rules around some aspects of sexuality that don't make any sense. Just like Christianity, right? Very hard rules around some parts of sexuality that don't seem to make a lot of sense from the outside. And both of them are associated with a lot of fear. You're gonna, and they're both associated with a lot of guilt if you do it wrong. Which isn't to say that consent is important. Of course it is, but because they got rid of all the other rules, right? Conservative Christianity says tons of rules around what is a good sexual relationship. Fundamentalist wokeism says no rules, except these extremely hard rules that don't make any sense that we had to put in because we didn't have any rules around the other stuff, right? Like if you have norms around the idea that, well, the best sexual relationship is a monogamous relationship where you both love each other and are committed to each other and communicating with each other. You don't have to come up with these ridiculous rules that say, well, if both people get a little tipsy or get sloshed and then have sex, then they're raping each other. You don't have to have that rule because there's the presumption that the right kind of sex is between two people that love each other and can manage getting drunk with each other and getting sexual with each other without harming each other. So they both have their own absolutist parts towards sexuality. They're both fundamentalist parts, which are backed up with this threat of extreme shame and ostracism. They both have a territorial aspect to them. So Christian nationalism, which wasn't really a thing when I was growing up in the way that it is now, he's co-constituent with some of these big words. Oh, I hate you learn these big words and then you use them and everybody thinks you're a jerk. Which includes very, very hard ideas around the territory of the nation state. That's the territoriality that's asserted, and the territoriality that's asserted within wokeism is usually around the university, and so that's why you see people with divergent viewpoints who come to the university who are subject to really extreme protests, and sometimes physical assault. And people that have had, I think about, there's a gender activist, and I forget what her name is, conservative gender activist or sex activist, who was advocating to kick men out of women's sports. And she came to speak, I believe it's Stanford or Berkeley, and she ended up being cloistered in this room because security didn't think it would be safe for her to leave. There was another guy, Charles Murray, and he and a colleague, I believe, were assaulted when they came to a campus. So there's a very strong territorial aspect to it. Another commonality between fundamentalist Christianity and wokeism is a dichotomy of contamination and purity. I think this is really important. So contamination and purity are definitely fundamentalist and religious impulses. You see this all the way back in the Old Testament in Christianity, where there is a real emphasis on identifying what is impure and must be expelled from the body and expelled from the social body. So, for example, if a woman is menstruating, she's considered to be unclean and she has to go separate from the community. And I'm going to do a little digression. It's interesting to think about why this is the case, why sanctity and purity is the case. And I think, and the psychologist Jordan Peterson has talked about this, and I'm by no means endorsing everything he says, but I think he has something very intriguing to say about this, that the psychological and religious emphasis on sanctity and purity is connected to the human physiological affect of disgust, which is something that is used to expel pathogens, right? It's a very strong process and disposition within the body, right? If you ever tried to not throw up when you felt like throwing up, it's very hard to do. And we have our sense of disgust activated by the smell of fecal matter, for example, and spoiled food. And the purpose is to keep us from ingesting pathogens and dying. So it's a very strong response. But he had the theory, and I think it's worth exploring. He talks about, in particular, with respect to Hitler, that we can have that fundamentalist ideology actually is, in some ways, an activation of the disgust response. It's a desire to expel that which is considered impure from the body and then from the social body. And so, growing up, there was a very large emphasis on not having impure thoughts. Right. So an impure thought would be to have a lustful thought about a woman, for example. Or if you want to not use that kind of normative language, to just have a sexy thought about someone that's walking by, right? That was considered impure. And again, which references unadulterated food, right? Adulterated food or unadulterated food, adulterated drink, unadulterated drink, right? These things are connected to each other in the brain and in the body. And there's definitely an emphasis on purity and contamination in wokeism. And you saw this with the targeting of individuals for transgressions that were so minor you couldn't even call them transgressions. There was a fellow at a school, I believe up in Los Angeles, I think it was UCLA, a business professor who was explaining a Chinese term to his students. And this term superficially resembled our N-word. Again, it's a taboo, so that's why I'm not saying it. Although I think I should be able to if I'm talking about it, metalinguistically. But I'll go ahead and observe it. Why not? And this guy was forced to issue an apology. Didn't say the word, just said a word that sounded like the word. And then some students that were ill-meaning tried to get this guy to have his job lost. Try to expel this guy. And so he had all these relatively minor transgressions of people saying things that either were totally benign, or maybe just were a little poorly thought out, and people came down on them. And I think one of the main motivating factors behind this pattern towards social ostracism was the desire to keep the body politic pure, to keep the social body pure, and the perception that if contamination was let in the form of ideology that didn't conform, that this was a threat to the body, to the social body, and by extension to individuals' bodies. And I don't think it's any coincidence that wokeism, and especially the emphasis on sanctity and purity, increased at the very same time that we had an actual epidemic. And the actual epidemic fed the extremism in wokeism, and wokeism in turn construed the epidemic as more existentially fraught than it was, and justified all kinds of actions on the parts of public health authorities that were not backed by science, and were in fact totalitarian. I mean, here at the university, which was the center of wokeism, we had the most extreme responses. Paradoxically, because we had one of the least susceptible populations to the virus. So we had a bunch of young people, for the most part, who almost all of them would have come through just fine. And yet, we were telling people to wear masks in their apartments. We were telling them to embody threat all the time. We had signs everywhere telling students that they were under threat, really hurting their anxiety. I think in the middle of the pandemic, suicide was still a much higher rate, a higher threat to mortality for, she really wants to get off, so I'm going to let her, to young people than the virus. So we had the most extreme forms of social control here. We had to be tested once a week, right? And we had to send over to the university administration our privileged health information, whether or not we tested. If we had any contact with the outside world, we had to self-isolate for a week. I live in a one-bedroom apartment here at the university. I was literally prevented from having my girlfriend over just to have dinner. So they inserted state control into my apartment, into my bedroom. And so there was the conjunction of actual pandemic, right, with real virus, real pathogens, the rise of wokeism as a fundamentalist religion with its emphasis on sanctity and purity, and the expulsion of anything that was perceived to be a social pathogen, right, which could be any sort of human being who voiced dissent from the extremely strongly enforced orthodoxy, and extremely strong versions of both physical social control and social control. Physical social control through the attempt to contain bodies, isolate bodies, control what they wore on their faces, the construal of human bodies as constantly a threat to other bodies, and then the social control, the construal of divergent ideology as a threat, right? And then interestingly enough, you also had the shutting down of churches. So you had the shutting down, the physical shutting down of the alternate form of religion, which I thought was very interesting. And in both cases, she wants to get up and run around, but I don't let her. There's coyotes. In both cases, there's a great deal of fear if you're one of the individuals that is a dissenter, especially and that leads people to be silent dissenters. So there was a great deal of fear of social ostracism, and not really social ostracism, but being guilty. There's an extreme fear of being guilty that I carried around from my upbringing in fundamentalist Christianity, and took a long time to deal with that and to reject that, and to view myself as someone who deserves love and kindness and grace, and as someone who's not fundamentally guilty, someone that can do things that are immoral, but I apologize for them and I try to learn from them, and then I move on, but I'm not guilty in sort of a fundamental sense. I think that's actually Orthodox Christianity. To be honest, Christ came to take away guilt, not to give more guilt. If you're a Christian, if that's what you believe, you keep moving away from the sun. And there was an extraordinary cost to being a dissenter under COVID. As I mentioned earlier in a previous video, we had discrimination on the basis of race, which was part of the religion. old Christianity certainly associated sort of salvation or a lack of blame, to the extent that it had a lack of blame, with whiteness, and what it construed as whiteness, and more guilt with what it construed as blackness. And you have that in wokeness. It's just the opposite way. It's just you just switch the associations, and now you associated this putative whiteness with guilt, and putative blackness with, well, at least less guilt or not guilt. Um, and so, if you're a dissenter in one of these fundamentalist systems, I think the deep nervous system of the acolytes of and true believers of these systems perceives you as a potential pathogen that needs to be expelled from the social body. And I think my own deep nervous system picked up on this. It knew that I was in danger, right? In danger of having grants not given, in danger of being told that my work just wasn't good enough. And again, at the university, they don't really have to give you a reason. It's all subjective. They're the experts. You're not. If they say you're not going on, you're not going on. And if you're dealing with a bunch of fundamentalist ideologues and religionists who don't have at the top of their hierarchy of value science and fair treatment, but instead have at the top of their hierarchy of value the advancement of their religion, and in fact come to see science and fairness not as real things, but as simply manifestations of power that their religion requires them to critique, well, then they're under no obligation, from their view, to act according to these fictions of fairness and standards for science. And again, this was laid out to me explicitly, this idea that objectivity wasn't real. The idea that science was inherently oppressive. So if you're a dissenter, if you're a religious dissenter at best, or a whistleblower at worst, again, I've talked about that, what guarantee do you have that you're going to be treated fairly when the very people who are going to be evaluating your work have openly said that they don't believe that objectivity exists? Well, according to what standards will your work be judged, if not according to objectivity, according to objective standards? According to the subjective standards of whether or not they think that you're the kind of person that advances the religion. At least if I was a whistleblower in chemistry, nobody would be operating under the pretensions that objectivity doesn't exist and science doesn't exist. But operating under the so-called standards of social science, the very people who have evaluated my work and have told me that they're going and are going in the position to evaluate my work in the future, have told me, at least one of them told me, they don't believe objectivity exists. It's like, well, what are you going to judge me on? And how do I know you're not going to judge me on the basis of whether or not your deep nervous system perceives that I'm a pathogen? Well, you don't. So broadening this out to talk about dissent, trauma, and group psychology, I think that any dissenter within a fundamentalist religious system is risking and knows at some sense deep down that they're risking ostracism. And that creates chronic stress. And over time, that can create traumatization. And it certainly did for me in both cases. And this discussion helps me to understand something which has been very difficult for me, because I simply am not the kind of person who believes something because people around me believe it. I just have never been that way. But it helps me to understand what is one of the motivating factors for why people believe absurd things all of a sudden, just because everybody else around them does. Because that's what happened here. Nobody was talking about defunding the police, and then 3 weeks later, everybody was convinced that we had to defund the police. Like, nobody thought for themselves. Everyone was just looking around, and this idea just spread like wildfire. People just adopted it because everyone else was adopting it. Well, why? You could say, well, part of it's because they lack the faculties to actually evaluate a belief on the basis of whether or not it's true, which is really scary when you're talking about social scientists, that this thing caught on so fast. It really indicates that these people are not making independent, objective evaluations of their beliefs. They're just saying what they're saying because it's fashionable, which I think is a pretty good argument for why we ought to get rid of social science, at least in anthropology and probably places like sociology. I'm not sure the people that are doing it are actually fit to do it. Uh, but there's another reason why I think people would do it, and it's a functionalist reason, and it's precisely because they want to avoid being traumatized. They don't want to be the kind of person that dissents from the fundamentalist religion, from the fundamentalist ideology. That's scary. That puts them at risk. It's much easier to just adopt the group norms. Um, there was a person I talked with who, in the middle of the Great Awakening, 2000, 2001, members of the anthropology department sent off a number of emails to the listserv. These were professors to their students, not about any departmental or university business, but instead affirming their association with and allegiance to political positions. So they abuse their power, they abuse the resources of the university in order um, to advance their own political ends, and by extension, acted in a way that was extraordinarily intimidating to their low power students below them. But anyway, I asked one of these professors, I confronted one of these professors, and I asked this professor why they signed this letter. And this professor said, well, they just wanted to be supportive of their colleagues. And I thought to myself, wait, you signed a letter that you didn't agree with just because you wanted to support your colleagues? I think maybe at the bottom of that was a desire to not dissent from the colleagues. Like, why would you want to support somebody the claims of people who are saying something that's not true? I think a lot of people went along with it because they didn't want to dissent. They didn't want to be perceived as dissenting because, at some sense, they knew that there was some danger behind that. Maybe not full-on danger of social ostracism, but certainly the danger of social censure and worrying about what the people are going to think of you. So what do we do? You know, what do you do if you're a person that is pretty close to being as immune to group psychology as you can? I mean, I have a little bit of autism trait. I think that's one of the reasons why I just don't get it. But what do you do when you're a dissenter in a society where you have these fundamentalist group psychology groups and religionists? When you're a dissenter, I'm struggling with that. I don't know what to do. My strategies are turn on a bunch of news blockers so I don't see their rhetoric, right? At the university, pick something to research that's not really well connected to a lot of the religiosity. Take good care of myself, get lots of massages, expand my mind regularly, so I can kind of get free a little bit of this stuff. Have a good counselor, get lots of hugs at church. But it sucks. You know, if you're one of these people that's got one of these, you know, these really, really strong beliefs, you know, ask yourself, is there behind that the threat of judgment for people that don't think the way that you do? How much time are you going around judging other folks? Because the other folks realize it. They know it. They're afraid of it. They don't like it. And it's not going to turn out well. You're not going to convince them. You're just going to get them angry and frustrated. And at best, at worst, you're going to do some psychological damage to people. And don't be so sure that you understand the reasons for why you believe what you believe. I talked about this on my whistleblowing video. Like, we're all trying to get our needs met. The unconscious is working to try to make that happen. And often the unconscious works in such a way to get our needs met and makes that decision. And then the cortex, the part that works with abstract reasoning, comes along in the wake of the decision that's already been made and comes up with the justification post facto and tells itself that the post facto justification is in fact the real reason why the decision has been made, when in fact it's just the rationalization that followed along later. So don't be too sure that you know why you think what you think. Generally speaking, you're not going to do a very good job, I think, of pursuing the truth when you're feeling a lot of fear. Because you're feeling a lot of fear, your goal is going to be to get yourself safe. That's kind of the first need that presents itself to your consciousness. It's not going to be to look after the truth per se, to find the truth per se. Okay, I think that's it. That's it for the day. I think maybe in a future video I'll try to talk about healthy religion. Like, what does a healthy religion look like? I do think human beings are inherently religious creatures. We all struggle with these existential questions of how to make sense of suffering, how to make sense of the fact that we can anticipate our own death, which is pretty unique among consciousnesses. How do we manage anxiety? How do we organize ourselves into helpful communities that have sort of values that are larger than ourselves, so that we can, anticipate and count on other people doing things. She's coming back. She came up. She wants to go over to the fence over there. How do we do this in a way that is healthy and that doesn't communicate to people who don't believe the same things that we do that we are in fact a threat to them? How do we practice threat-less religion? That's a good question. Maybe I'll do another video about that. But that's it for the day. So thanks for listening.